Hello, welcome to podcast by Propel by Deloitte. My name is Mark Dolman and I lead the Propel team, and Propel was launched 3 years ago to support early stage businesses and ambitious SMEs. Our client base spreads across the whole spectrum of business, from sole traders who may be under the VAT registration, corporates under the VAT registration, but predominantly ambitious businesses that are growing, either hitting or above the VAT registration, which I think we all know is £85,000, and therefore this whole thing around making tax digital is really relevant to them. And of course it's not just about VAT, but it's also about the other taxes, personal tax and corporation tax. What we do know, talking to our client base, is that most of them don't really know what's going on. And so we felt it was really important to try and get across what's actually happening. So I'm delighted to be joined by Shara Idrakuma. Shara, welcome. Thanks. You for joining us here. Can you just give us a quick introduction about who you are?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Mark. So my name's Shara, and I am an Associate Director in the Tax Management Consulting part of Deloitte, and currently leading the campaigns part of our MTD drive. We have a core team that sits in within TMC that leads the MTD drive, and as part of that, we are seeing sort of massive changes across the tax landscape from a VAT perspective, and definitely clients, as you mentioned, Mark, coming across these challenges and looking to overcome these challenges on their journey to becoming MTD ready.
Yeah, okay, fabulous. Well, thank you very much for joining us. It's great to have an expert here because I am not an expert. So before we go into what I know is the guts of the conversation around VAT, I just want to pick up on the other two taxes, personal tax and corporation tax. Can you give us a little timeline as to what's actually happening with those two taxes, please?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's good to bring those into focus as well. So in terms of personal income tax and corporate tax, we know from a Making Tax Digital perspective that they are on the agenda and they are coming. What we do know from a personal income tax perspective, for example, there is a pilot scheme that's open to submit digitally your personal income tax. Now, the exact ins and outs for corporate tax and personal tax are yet to be determined, and definitely as part of this podcast that we're sort of doing and our conversation that we're having here, VAT is going to be a huge driver and a definite, lessons learned from VAT to inform that decision-making process for corporate and income tax.
And so just going back a couple of years, the government made a statement that they were going to have a sort of a three-phase approach: VAT, personal tax, corporate tax. That has clearly slipped over the period across all of those. So if I'm hearing it right, there is now no definite date in terms of personal tax or corporation tax in terms of when they will come in, and indeed what they expect to happen when they do come in. So at the moment is a watching brief. Is that right?
That's right. And the watching brief is definitely going to be determined by the likes of sort of VAT. And you're right that, we don't know where the exact timelines for those two are. But what we do know is that VAT front for sort of this year and next in terms of the legislation that's coming in.
So let's come to VAT then, which is the core of the changes. So can you just quickly outline to us then what's happening this April and in 12 months' time?
Yeah, sure. So from a Making Tax Digital perspective, as you rightly mentioned, there are sort of three key dates that come into play. So when we look at the likes of what's going to happen this year from April 2019 and also October 2019, HMRC are expecting you to have your digital records and digital submissions in place for VAT. Now, from 2020, and we'll sort of go into further detail of this, so from April 2020 and October 2020, the second part of that is your digital links component. Now, when we sort of look at this from a April 2019 perspective and the digital records part of it, so we'll cover that one first. So for digital records, there is an expectation that, for example, when you receive an invoice from a supplier and you capture that information in a tax accounting software package, whatever that might be, those details that are VAT pertinent to your VAT determination process are stored digitally. Now, what we do tend to see is that's definitely happening in a sort of tax accounting software or package, and storing those records need to be stored for at least 6 years is the other part of that. Now, most accounting packages and softwares will do that anyway. So if you're currently operating with one, you'll tend to see that you'll find yourself okay in that part of the legislation. There is an exercise being undertaken in that to ensure that data is clean from a tax reporting perspective for VAT. But essentially, that's where we see ourselves for the digital records component.
And just to pick up on that, because I think that's a piece of it that has passed a number of people by, including me, which is we've all focused on the submission of records to HMRC as being digital. But actually what you're saying is there's a really important component of this, which is about storing records in a digital format. And actually that's probably, in the short term, the bigger issue for an organisation. When you say storing records in a digital format, what do we mean? Do we have to keep all of our records, like invoices received from suppliers, in a digital format and expenses, or are there certain components of that need to be stored?
Yeah, so it's essentially, you'll find yourselves falling into one of those two areas. Now, the first area you might find yourself is you take the invoice and you store the information, you type that information into your tax accounting software package to enable you to report those transactions for VAT purposes. In that scenario, you don't need to store the VAT invoice digitally, but a copy of the invoice should be kept for record purposes, but it doesn't need to be stored digitally. As long as you've captured the VAT pertinent information and you're storing that information within a tax accounting software package. The second part of that, and this may sort of touch upon some of the client base that are reaching out within this podcast as well, but the second part of that is where you take the invoice and you will be able to scan that straight into your system and from there lift and shift the VAT pertinent information. If you're falling into that category, again, you will find yourselves being compliant with the digital record part of the legislation because you've captured that invoice and you've stored it digitally.
Okay, but of course there are going to be some that are with packages that are probably desktop type packages, or they're doing things using spreadsheets or whatever it might be, where they've got the dual issue of how do I file electronically, which I'd like you to cover in a bit more detail, but also how do I store these records. So I think, I'm not going to put you on the spot here, but I think our research tells us that a lot of the desktop players are working at how they resolve this at the moment and are coming out with solutions to help businesses with how they store the digital information and how they do the submissions to HMRC. And therefore, what we're recommending our client base is to consult with their accounts package provider. Now, if they're not with an accounts package provider at the moment, and they're in the VAT threshold, they're really going to have to start to look to some of these tools to help them with being able to VAT file and to store the appropriate information. So if I'm concerned as a business at the moment about whether I store or whether I can file appropriately, what would you be recommending to these businesses?
Yeah, it's a good question, Mark. And in terms of that, what you've highlighted there is definitely almost a key fundamental to this whole change that we're seeing, and it's the manner in which you're, first of all, storing your data and the journey of that data to the end sort of VAT reporting. Now, the whole concept of data and the manner in which it's moved from left to right throughout your organisation. When I say left to right, I mean entering your data into a software package, for example, and then exporting that data out into Excel, if that's what you do. The journey of that data is very important. Now, businesses that are looking to start to comply and sort of want to understand how to move towards compliance for the digital records perspective, it is definitely understanding your current process of what you're doing to get that information. For example, if you're storing that information handwritten on a piece of paper, or if you have that information stored on a piece of paper, that will, and you get to April 2019, that will no longer be compliant. That information needs to be stored digitally somewhere, whether it's on sort of an Excel, if it's on an accounting software piece of package. So those businesses that are looking to comply, that need to move towards the compliance of the digital records component, it is definitely about starting to look at your options in terms of how your data currently is stored from a digital records perspective with the components that we mentioned earlier on.
Okay, and so let's come back to submissions to HMRC, and I know you've mentioned April and October. Can you just give us an overview of what we submit in April and what we submit in October and why there are two dates?
Yeah, definitely. So the fundamental to the two dates are essentially, when we look at the April 2019 deadline, those are for, we're seeing sort of single entity VAT registrations, for example, less complex businesses having to go live with the digital submission component in April 2019. HMRC have introduced a deferment to more complex businesses, such as those that are payment on account, VAT grouped, for example. Now, that is definitely a recognition from HMRC's point of view to say, yep, we get it, that there is a little bit of work to be done, and those that have a little bit more complexities involved in their business, there may be VAT groups, they need to understand how that architecture and landscape lies. They will be pushed to the deferment and they will need to comply with the digital submission piece from October 2019.
And is it as simple as that? I will know because I'm either a VAT group, I'm submitting as a group, or I'm doing payment on account, and therefore I know that I'm October, or are there some nuances that I need to be aware of?
So another great point again, Mark. So what needs to happen here is that if you believe or if you feel that you are to be deferred to October 2019, you should get that written confirmation from HMRC to say, yep, you are going to be deferred to October 2019 and you'll need to comply sort of then. We are advising our clients to do that purely for the case that you get to April 2019 and you don't want to scare and you're having to comply. So whilst it's clear that, and sort of HMRC have communicated that there are particular types of businesses that have been deferred, it is definitely advisable to get confirmed with HMRC that you are being deferred to October 2019.
So we have some clients who might be a VAT group, but might be a VAT group of two relatively small entities. So I can imagine there could be some confusion around that. So So I understand the recommendation. If you're not sure, either start from April or go and ask whether you qualify. I understand that. The second point I just wanted to clarify is what happens if you don't get it right? What's the penalty regime? Is it clear what that penalty regime is, or do you think there will be some latitude in the early period, or do we just not know?
So the penalty regime that's going to be associated with this, as far as we know at the moment, is the current penalties that are associated to non-compliance with submitting your VAT return. So those same penalties will apply across the board to this phase of making tax digital. Whether that gets adapted slightly from HMRC is something one to watch, again, another watching brief, but what you can sort of confidently see and sort of definitely look at is that any penalties that currently apply to you not submitting your VAT return will also apply to this part of making tax digital as well.
Okay, but the key penalties that I think I'm aware of are that if you don't properly submit, either you're late, your VAT return, or you're not compliant with some of the rules and regs, however you've paid your VAT, then there are certain types of penalties, but they're clearly more onerous if you underpay your VAT. So if I'm paying my VAT but seem not to be digitally compliant in keeping records, what would happen in that scenario, do you think?
So I think again it's going to be coming down to your appetite and your sort of open conversation with HMRC at the same time to show that you are moving towards compliance. Now, there are steps that can be undertaken to mitigate your risk. Definitely to mitigate your risk is key here. Whilst it may take you a little while to get your sort of head around and get your business in order to comply, there are definite steps and clear steps that can be taken to comply with the legislation. That might be a step back from your current indirect tax compliance process, looking at it end to end, understanding where your pain points are, where your gaps are, and looking to remediate those gaps. And if you can sort of show that you're moving towards that digital submission, that will definitely, it's definitely a great step in terms of heading in the right direction.
Okay, but I think, loud and clear though, our view will be, you should try and comply with these
Correct.
rules. At the end of the day, it's good to be able to demonstrate you're moving in the right direction, but these rules have been out for a while now,
Yes.
and so we would be encouraging businesses to comply, and also if they've got concerns around the records, to either talk to us. Yeah. We're happy to speak to them, whether that's Deloitte broadly or Propel,
yeah.
Or to talk to their accounts package provider. But of course, this is a great driver for moving people to more and more towards digital processes.
Yes.
And obviously, I think we're all moving towards digital processes in all walks of life. So there's a sort of natural shift here. Can you just cover again actually what is submitted in April and October digitally, and then where that goes over the next 12 months as we start to move towards even more digital submissions?
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of the first 2 days, so April 2019 or October 2019, depending on which one you fall into, all that HMRC are actually asking you to submit digitally are the 9 boxes on your VAT return. The backing information that's associated to that data, it hasn't currently been requested, whilst we will move towards that age, as you rightly pointed out earlier on. At the moment, for these first 2 components in this first year, so over the course of 2019, it is just the 9 boxes that are being requested to be passed over to them digitally. Now, how that's being done currently is essentially through bridging software. Again, as you rightly pointed out, if you have a tax accounting software package, it would be definitely beneficial to have that conversation with your provider to understand where they fit into that remit of being able to connect up to HMRC digitally. But the landscape of it essentially is a piece of bridging software between yourselves, your business, and HMRC. So where you used to be able to go into the portal, so currently you might be going into the HMRC portal and typing in your 9 numbers. That portal will effectively close as soon as you opt in to digitally submit your VAT return. The expectation from that point is that you would have a piece of software in place to push over the 9 boxes to HMRC.
Okay, and we've been saying previously that we see this as the start of broader digital records. So, two things. Where do we see it going from a VAT perspective? And I guess what are we seeing internationally, which may give us a clue as to where our environment's going to go?
Yeah, again, another sort of fantastic topic to actually be looking at from this part of the agenda. Now, making tax digital from a UK perspective is definitely HMRC's ambition to be a digital, sort of at the forefront of this digital agenda. As you rightly pointed out, we're moving into this era. We've already started the era of the digital agenda, and more pertinently, the digital tax agenda. Now, internationally, we are seeing a huge global digital tax mandate. We can definitely learn lessons from those and understand the trend that that's heading towards. So if we pick, for example, the likes of SAFT in the Nordic countries, in Portugal, if we pick SII in particular in Spain, where businesses are required to report their transactions every 4 days, whilst that was an initial hurdle, there were initial hurdles to overcome, it's effectively working now. We see it working, we see the authorities and businesses interact on that period, and everything is happening. It's a move towards that digital agenda.
So just picking up on that international element again, those are all picking up information from a VAT perspective, is that right? Can you just sort of clarify exactly how it works?
That's correct, yeah. So from that perspective, we see transactions needing to be submitted to authorities from a VAT perspective, for them to be VAT authorised, etc., to essentially be reported every 4 days. Now, what that is starting to move towards, and sort of we're seeing the trend towards, not just in Spain, but we're seeing sort of even more broader, even as far as sort of Latin America, and definitely Asia Pacific as well. But we are starting to see that move and trend towards real-time reporting. Whilst from a UK perspective, that's not going to happen this year, next year, potentially 3 years down the line. It is an indication, the global trends are an indication towards where this is headed. And it is around that global digital mandate where effectively we may get to a point where the authorities, tax authorities, are able to plug directly into your source systems and tell you how much you owe them or how much they owe you, essentially.
Okay, wow, big brother's there.
Yeah.
So, just understanding that in a bit more detail, though, are there specific deadlines in the UK around going beyond the 9 boxes being digital? Because I think what we're seeing is, as you've described, a global movement towards trending to real-time reporting. But where, have we got any firm deadlines yet on the next steps?
So the firm deadlines that we do have in play are both the April and October 2019 deadlines for digital submission, and then the April and October 2020 deadlines for digital links. That's as far as HMRC have come into play at the moment. But in terms of that introduction...
Can I just pick you up? You said digital links. Can you just clarify what that means?
Yeah, so digital links, and we can definitely go into this a little bit deeper, is essentially the manner in which your data moves from your source system into your Excel environment over to HMRC. If there is a link, if there's a broken link in that data somewhere, essentially that's what's going to be scrutinized. Now, let's pick up on that definitely, because I think that's another whole topic of conversation that we can discuss. But to go back to your question on that, is essentially what we are seeing is HMRC introducing this legislation in these 3 components, so your record, submissions and links. What that is building a picture of is that move towards automation for your VAT return, is getting you in a better state. So whilst in the short to medium term, there are a couple of challenges that businesses are going to face that they need to overcome. And they can overcome that through the use of technology, through the use of automation. So whilst in that short to medium term there are those challenges, in the long term, this is a great play for getting your indirect tax process end-to-end, in line, automated, being comfortable with how you process VAT, how you record that VAT and how you submit that VAT. So in the long run, we are moving towards a more efficient process.
I like the way you've turned that round from this is a burden to this is a benefit, which actually I think we can see, but I'm sure in the short term this will feel like a burden. So if I can just summarise what I think I've heard, it's that April, simple businesses need to submit their 9 boxes in a digital format. From October, more complex groups, payments on accounts need to submit in a digital format, but we recommend that those businesses check that they can wait till October.
Correct.
At the same time that they need to submit their return in a digital format, they also need to be storing their information in a digital format. And so we're saying very loudly to organisations and businesses that you need to check with your process and with your package providers that you're going to be compliant in that context. Then we're saying in 12 months' time, you need to follow through this next phase of VAT, which is about these links. And if I understand it, but please clarify, the links bit is that you need to go from a trial balance and be able to digitally show how you move from a trial balance through to the return that you've sent, so that there's clear if any adjustments have been made, that there's a evidence of and a record of what those adjustments were and why. Is that summary approximately right?
Yeah, that's 10 out of 10 mark there. So in terms of that digital links component, let's dig into that, and everything that you've described so far chronologically is exactly that. So from April 2020, there is the expectation from HMRC that you'll have digital links in place throughout your VAT return process. Now, what that means exactly is, and let's pick an example here. So you may be an organisation that has a piece of accounting software. You will have your digital records and all your data in that piece of software. You may then extract that data into Excel, for example. And then you may start to make your adjustments, formatting data, and essentially getting your data ready for submission, and you'll move into that space of Excel. Now, This is exactly where that digital links component comes into place. All of that manual intervention that you're making in the Excel environment. So for example, if you're copy pasting data, after you've extracted that data out of your source system and put it into Excel, if you then take that data, copy paste it into another tab, which you might do because that's how you currently prepare your VAT return. If you're doing that, if you're reformatting data, if you're moving columns around, if you're adding sort of VAT pertinent information, all of those types of things are what are going to be captured by the digital links component. Now, what I mean by that is HMRC would expect you to stop doing that, and how they expect you to stop doing that, there are a number of ways that can be sort of tackled. One of those methods is to enable macros, for example, in your Excel environment. Essentially, macros will create your digital link and identify where your changes are being made. Now, that's definitely out there for less complex businesses that are definitely operating in that Excel environment, and they may wish to have a look at what that type of benefit will bring to them. So that's almost sort of to comply and improve, to get yourself into a clean state within your Excel environment, essentially. The other part of that is definitely what we're seeing more and more of is transformation. Now, whilst this might not apply to all businesses, it is a bucket on its own, because this is the point where businesses, sort of, whether it's the head of finance, or if you're a head of indirect tax, head of tax, whatever it is, but this is the point in time where they're saying, actually, this is my opportunity to transform. It's my opportunity to make that change. I've been trying to do it for the last few years, but I've got actually, an excuse now. I've got a piece of legislation that I can use to transform my indirect tax compliance process.
No, I understand that, and I genuinely can see there are a lot of businesses that, if they're smart, will use this as the opportunity to streamline their process, automate where possible, and of course, from that, it actually in the long term will mean they do it in a much better way, but also they do it at a low cost.
Definitely.
So there's a real opportunity here. But I still reiterate, I understand the average entrepreneur and SME who are going, this is still a bit of a pain in the butt. So.
Yeah, definitely. And there are a number of ways that both, as you mentioned, Propel and Deloitte can sort of inform that journey of change to help you comply with the digital links component. The dependencies are definitely your as-is process. What are you currently doing to get your VAT return together and submit it? That is a great starting point for any, indirect tax manager or whoever's preparing the return or whoever's in charge of this. It's a great starting point to just take a step back and look at your end-to-end process. Within there, you will then identify where exactly you may be breaking links. Totally understand it from the perspective of adjustments being made, for example. There are particular adjustments that can continue to operate outside of MTD, but those need to be looked at and definitely clarified with HMRC. There are things such as import VAT, so C79s, that some businesses may be receiving. Again, they will continue to operate in the manner in which they currently do. But this is definitely aimed at that copy pasting of data where, and it's a fair point as well. So when we look at sort of copy pasting data, there is definitely that risk of missing particular bits of data. There's that risk of incorrectly transferring data across and then essentially affecting your NVAT reporting. So that's where it sits from a digital links component at the moment.
Okay, well, thank you for that. So, Chow, I'm going to a couple of quick fires. Okay, just sort of the unusual bits of VAT. So first question: are there any organisations or businesses that might be exempt from this, e.g., charities?
So, what we've seen so far, and as far as the legislation goes, everyone needs to make a change. That sort of MTD impacts every single business out there at the moment. Of course, there is that £85,000 turnover threshold that you need to meet, but every single business needs to make this change.
So no exemptions. Okay. Second one is, so where I'm a growing internet-enabled business and selling in multi countries, at the moment they do the EC sales lists and or they have to register overseas depending on if they go over the overseas thresholds. Has anything changed in that context?
So EC sales list remains outside the context of MTD for the moment. Of course, we've got things such as Brexit, which are going to impact those types of areas, but the manner in which those start to line up and start to move towards a digital transformation, definitely keep an eye out and have in the back of your mind that they will move towards that digital transformation piece, such as MTD.
Okay, and are there any other elements of VAT, the bits that our clients will scratch their heads on, or, am I nil rate, partial exemptions, those sorts of things? Is there anything there where you'd say, hey, there's this impacts, or does that at the moment flow through in sort of the 9-box approach? So
in terms of things such as partial exemption, let's pick that one for example. Now, that is definitely a complexity that businesses face. Everyone understands that, so do HMRC. There is that expectation down the line that partial exemption will fall into the bracket of MTD, but currently the manner in which your partial exemption method is undertaken is definitely worth clarifying just quickly with HMRC to say, we know that partial exemption falls outside of MTD. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to sort of pick up on is this is the opportunity to, again, look at your partial exemption method, for example, if should you be captured in that bracket, and have a look at how that method is being operated. Again, it's a complexity that's recognised as a more complex part of your VAT returns process, but you should have one eye on the fact that it will move and trend towards digitization, essentially.
Okay, and I think I take from that, where you've got any complexity around VAT, it's a good time now to have a fresh look at it, make sure that you're comfortable with the approach, and look at it in the context of making tax digital.
That's right.
Shara, thank you very much for that. We now know a lot more about making tax digital. I'm Mark Dolman. I lead Propel by Deloitte. This is the first in our series of podcasts. Thank you for listening.